Welcome back, everybody. As you can see, I'm wearing my AUSA swag. I was over there observing the area. You guys did not go over there and check out some of the stuff. Come on, help us out here. And if you're nice, I might even buy you a hat. Our next panel's topic, social media's role in influencing global affairs. Social media has become an incredible influence over modern populaces. It's used for targeting, misinformation, election influence, naming and shaming, etc. How does the U.S. best leverage it to our advantage? To moderate this discussion, we have my good friend, Major General retired John Davis, the Vice President of Public Sector for Palo Alto Networks. Before joining the public sector, John served as a senior military advisor for cyber to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and served as the acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber Policy. John has a Master's of Strategic Studies from the U.S. Army War College, a Master's of Military Arts and Science for the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, and a Bachelor of Science from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, General. Hello, everyone. Good morning. It is, as an old Army information warfare professional, it is really an honor to be able to moderate this panel with such distinguished professionals. And I know you're going to enjoy it, but I'm probably going to enjoy this discussion more than you are. Let me go ahead and introduce our panel members. We have going down the panel, Charity Wright, Principal Threat Intelligence Consultant for Recorded Future, Jason Barret, Open Source Intelligence Executive in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, Lydia Snider, Advisor, Foreign Malign Influence, U.S. Army Cyber Command, and Dennis Eger, Senior Executive, Open Source Intelligence, Office of the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army, G2, United States Army. So distinguished panel, and the way we're going to do this will take about the first 25 minutes of the hour with some prepared questions, and then the second 25 minutes or so, questions from you. That first 25 minutes should get the juices flowing so that you can send your questions up here. And then I'll try to save the last 5 or 10 minutes to let our panel members give some key takeaways that they want you all to walk out of here with. So that's our plan of action. And since we only have an hour, we're going to get right to it. And I'll start with the first question for Lydia. And obviously with this topic, how has social media changed the digital threat landscape?
So good morning. I would say that I would even just take the digital out of that and say, how has it changed the threat landscape? The primary thing it did was it removed our borders. Until the advent of social media, we had the luxury of oceans on either side and allies above and below. With the advent of social media, those borders have been removed. In 2016, I was just a regular person. I was a social media marketer. And I was part of the online community that found the Russian activity. And for me, I had the same visceral response as I had with 9/11. I viewed it as an attack on my country. And I struggled to get anybody to understand. 9/11, we had some dramatic explosions. But what people don't realize is we essentially had Red Dawn, if you remember that movie. We had Red Dawn in 2016. The original, absolutely, the original. I didn't even see the remake. Is there the original Red Dawn? But the Russians were able to get directly into the hearts and minds of our citizens in that year. And so for me, that is how that is what keeps me up at night and has continued to keep me up at night. And I want to give a shout out to both AUSA and Army Cyber for having the frontline thinking. I am here because AUSA in August of 2018 had me as a guest speaker on Hot Topics, and Army Cyber was present and then brought me on for that. So you guys have been listening. And I want to commend both agencies, both organizations for being forward thinking in this space. So this conversation today is not a surprise, but they removed the borders. And then the other thing that social media has done is created a precise, it has created the weapons of information mass destruction. It has created a tool set for precise precision targeting of audiences and very quick feedback on how your message landed. So I was in the first arms race with the social media platforms as a social media marketer at their early days. They were changing the algorithms. We were changing our tactics to get the messages in. That is what the Russians ran in 2016, was an effective social media marketing campaign with ethics-free. I know you probably think marketers don't have ethics. There is a degree. And well-funded, well-staffed. So that is what has happened. And if you want to look at what's happening next, look at the marketing space. That is where the cutting edge is. That is where the adversaries are looking for their next TTPs. And I will stop there and hand it over to others.
Hey, if I could quickly, I was going to wait, so I apologize to our moderator. I said I wouldn't drop this bomb too quickly, but I'll go ahead and drop it now because I think Lydia opened the door. So I'm doing some research now in preparation for writing an article, but this is Dennis Eger's thoughts. So, you know, this is my narrative. So don't tie it to the Army. I'm not saying this is the Army stance, but it is mine. I think our definitions of competition and conflict in this space are incorrect. I think we need to redefine what competition and conflict are. The borders are gone, as Lydia said, and she used the term direct attack, right? And so whether you use that term, a harsher term, a lighter term, I think if we don't start viewing things like that as an attack, and what do we determine to be an attack, and what do we determine is our definition of conflict, we are going to lose this race. I think if you were to get inside the minds of the Chinese or the Russians, they would view this in the long game, in the long term, as conflict. But we continue to use terms like competition, and this is the gray space, and we continue to use things and look at it in terms of, look at conflict in terms of kinetic, right, rather than what this is in this space. And I think if we don't change, we're going to look up 5 or 10 years from now and say, what did we do wrong? And so I really think our definitions of conflict and competition in this space need to change.
Go ahead, Charity.
You saw me, right? So my background is U.S. Army. I was a Chinese linguist, and then I transitioned into the private sector. Since I've been a researcher in the private sector, I have often come forward with similar mindsets because we are warfighters. That's what we prepare for. That's what we're looking at the horizon for. And it wasn't until I was working with a lot of academics and folks from nonprofits that they brought up a contrarian view. And that is that we can have fierce competition without conflict. And in the long term, it's not in anyone's best interest to go to war with China or fight a two-front war in Europe and Asia. I think Americans are very war weary. And to make it even more complicated, we appear to the rest of the world to be very war hungry. So supporting Ukraine, supporting Israel, our adversaries are taking advantage of this narrative. And what they're spreading around the world is that all we want is conflict and war. And so they take the opposite narrative when they portray themselves as peace-loving. Oh, we only want competition. We want peaceful competition with the West. But I'm going to actually side with you guys on this one. I have talked to my colleagues in the private sector about this as well, and told them, trust what they do, not what they say. And ultimately, I think that's important in influence operations. They are going to deceive their audiences into believing that they want long-term peace, and they're not trying to fight a power struggle for global power. But we can see from their actions much better what their intentions are long-term. We can see that through escalations in the Pacific and other areas as well. So when it comes to conflict, versus competition. I wish we could go forward with a mindset of, yeah, let's keep this competitive in nature. But unfortunately, it is a long-term strategy that they're working on here. And we see the incremental steps that maybe people in the private sector or researchers may not see long-term. Or maybe it's wishful thinking on their part. I don't know. But yeah, I love that point you brought up.
Let me, Jason, I'm going to turn to you to dive a little bit more into the detail. But before I do, just a perspective from being in the information warfare business since the mid-90s. I've talked to a lot of our adversaries about this, especially China. And they will tell you that they have watched the United States and our allies interfere in other nations through the color revolutions, Iran, Eastern Europe, the Arab Spring, and that scares the hell out of them more than anything else because they see that as an existential threat to the regimes. Iran, North Korea, Russia, China, they all see it that way. And so they've learned from us, and now they're turning all that against us. And you're absolutely right. I believe that they've moved the starting blocks, and bombs and bullets are still important, but they're trading it for information and influence because they see that as a way to achieve their objectives without crossing the traditional threshold of armed conflict. And it ties us in knots in the West, not just the US, but look at what's happening across the, our allies and partners around the world. So couldn't agree more. And Dennis, thanks for dropping the bomb early. But I'm going to turn to Jason, and I'm going to ask you specifically, how do our adversaries weaponize social media for global influence? What are the techniques that they use to do that?
So first of all, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Also appreciate the opportunity to have the questions changed at the last second. So you'll understand that my response here is hopefully teeing up others on this panel to then follow me. I think the key part here is looking at how quickly the weaponization has evolved over the last 10 years. That is for me, the big picture that is really important, because then if you project out forward, how does this continue to evolve? It will help us really think through, developing response mechanisms that frankly are where, the puck is going, not where the puck is right now. And I think too often we're focused on reacting to what has already happened as opposed to thinking about where the trajectory of social media manipulation and influence is going. But let's step back here for a second and look at how the weaponization has evolved. If you look at going back almost 10 years to what Lydia was referencing, you had a very sophisticated at the time approach to influencing the U.S. population, an attempt to, right? And then the question becomes not just influencing the U.S., but influencing global partners and allies. And the lessons learned that our adversaries are picking up from each other is what is to me most concerning over the years, because I think if you start to look at what has been published since then, and you look at how there is I don't know if you call it a step change yet, but there is certainly the evolutionary tactics there when it comes to our adversaries is certainly improving because they understand how to incorporate the feedback loop when it comes to the response to their social media engagements. And this is all obviously happening in the open source domain. So that's what I'm focused on is how quickly our adversaries are understanding not just our psychology, but based on the responses to their engagement, but how quickly their comments can help inform our approach to them. And I think if we don't look at it that way and incorporate a faster feedback loop into our own actions, we are going to be further and further behind. So I think just stepping back for a second and not just kind of teeing up others for this question, but also addressing the second the very first question that the panel had, I'm really, encouraged by some of the steps that the government has taken, and specifically some of our military partners, including the Army, have taken to incorporate a faster reaction modes to public engagement. I think if you don't have that faster feedback loop into our ability to communicate to our adversaries, but also to the American people, we will frankly be left behind in this debate. So I'll turn it over to others.
Yeah, let me hit one thing quickly, I guess, to Jason's point. So there's over 2 billion social media users today, 2 billion across the world. On average, people have 6.1 social media accounts, and nearly 50% of people in the world get their news from social media, not from traditional, what we would call traditional sources. That's where they get it from. Now, you want to talk about weaponizing it and the threat. As you start to add in the things that we see now, the algorithms that are placed on things, it puts you into this echo chamber where individuals are led down a path that confirms their beliefs, or they believe it confirms their beliefs anyway. The algorithm then allows them to keep seeing those things, and down the rabbit hole they go, right? That's how you influence populations. And I can't help but to think back to Sun Tzu's Art of War that says, how do you win a war without firing a shot? You divide the population, create disorder, right? So you don't have to. And Charity and I had this conversation earlier before we came in here that I don't even have to influence the US directly. Let me focus my campaign on allies and partners kind of on the outside, that allows them to put pressure on the US that then has impacts on foreign relations and diplomacy, right? But you can weaponize this quickly. It is, right? The internet is immediate. If you think about yourself when you get up in the morning, what are most people looking at? They're not looking for a Wall Street Journal. They're picking this up. And they're saying, oh, what's going on Facebook? What's going on LinkedIn? What's going on Twitter? What's going on Instagram? That's where you live, right? And so it's very easy for our enemies to target that and have an influence.
And to riff off of what you just said, one of the things that we need to be doing is better mapping and sensing and understanding the information space. There's 2 billion people, and they are not all on Twitter. Too much of our focus is on Twitter. And I'm looking at the Marines, AIBA, Information, Environment, Battle Space Awareness. I love the concept. And I think if you haven't read their manual on that, I recommend that. One of the ways that I knew, and I found the Russians, was I was so immersed in the space, I knew I could smell something was off and started pulling threads. We need to understand that space as well as we do. I'm not military background, but I know before you go in someplace, you really get a good understanding of that physical environment. We need to treat the information environment the same way. And we need to be mapping every country. Like one of the goals I'm working on is for the Pacific region. What is the media landscape for each country, and not just the legacy media, but what apps do they use? There's the Line app, Line. That is one of the most popular apps in the Pacific region. If we are not on that, if we are not tracking that, we are missing whole swaths of information. So whatever is your region, what apps are people actually on, and get into that space, because by the time it gets onto Twitter, that's old. That's like when they're trying to influence America. Like that, the planning happens, the tribe building, all of that is happening on those other apps. So I will stop there.
Let me ask for, we were talking about China, Asia Pacific region. Let me go to Charity. And so why does China care about influencing global opinion or different audiences associated with the global landscape?
I'll combine my response to what you all said with this new question, is that social media is a weapon for psychological warfare. Bottom line, it is probably the best, most utilized tool globally for PSYOPs. So consider it from that perspective. China has a long game in mind. They have a grand strategy for their rise, and they are able to use Western social media to influence the rest of the world. Now, a lot of people have a misunderstanding that China's influence operations are targeting US audiences. They do in some operations, but most of their influence operations happen globally and on a very large global scale. Why? They know they can influence audiences overseas that may have maybe a little problem with the US or maybe a problem with Americans in general. And they can influence those governments and those populations against the United States and our democratic allies. Let's just say that. China is set on using any method possible to convince audiences that they have a sustainable form of governance that could actually work for the rest of the world. So what they're doing is they're positioning themselves as, this Chinese Communist Party. They find nice, flowery ways to describe their governance to other countries and governments to convince them, you should do what we're doing. It's very effective. Look at how low crime is in our country. Look how many people are covered by healthcare. They're touting the benefits of their form of governance and positioning it against the United States version of democracy. So much so that last year they launched a huge propaganda campaign promoting China as a quote unquote whole process people's democracy. I know it's laughable. When I saw this emerging and the scale at which it was emerging on social media, I was like, this is a joke, right? Like they're not actually positioning themselves as a democracy, but indeed they were. And on that note, when we talk about scale of social media influence, it reminds me of a quote. Maybe my parents taught it to me or we just grew up, but you're probably familiar with it. Those who stand for nothing fall for everything. So one strategy in social media is flooding the information environment with so much information that it confuses audiences and they don't know what is real, what's fake, what's true, what's false. So, some people call it an infodemic or information crisis, but really, I think it's psychological. We don't have, in general, we don't have critical thinking skills to go find true information in our information environment. And this ties back to what Dennis was saying about people going to social media for news now. During the last couple presidential election cycles, my parents were just set on watching one particular news channel, and I was trying to encourage them to venture out and find more diverse news. And now my dad just watches YouTube, which is not a good solution. Okay, he comes to me with all kinds of conspiracy theories, and I'm like, wait a second, that's not what I meant. But it just shows how social media can be used for great things, for connection, for getting to know people in your own community, but it's also very dangerous because our adversaries are flooding our information environment with falsities and what is this whole people's process, whatever. I don't know. China, it was a very large scale campaign, so it was very interesting to see how they're trying to promote their own form of governance in competition to ours.
Thank you, Charity. We have some good questions from the audience here, but I want to try to combine the last of it because we're at about, the time limit before we go to Q&A. So I'm going to ask all of you, I'll start with Jason. So what do we do about this? How do we deal with misinformation, propaganda, and how do we, what can we do about these malign influence activities that we're dealing with as a result of the social media revolution? I'll start with Jason.
So if you look 75-year, thank you. If you look at the 75-year arc of kind of communication and trust with local populations or national populations, 75 years ago, Americans tuned in to a couple of networks, got there, and there was an incredible amount of trust in how they were getting in the communication that was going to them, how it was being absorbed, and then how they were, integrating that into their worldview. If you look at how things have rapidly changed over, frankly, just the last 20, 25 years, and the point we're at now, we are at a point now where our adversaries are better able to understand down to local populations what our population believes on a day-to-day basis, what their interests are, and how to influence them, one way or the other, and sometimes in opposite directions because they want to create and sow discord. But they're able to better understand our local populations than we are. Forget national populations; they're far, I think, able to do that. But down to the micro level, they're able to understand that. And so, if you look at that change, and especially how that has intensified over the past 20 years due to technological, developments, which frankly are wonderful, we have to figure out a way to start to rebuild trust. And the way that has been, I know we in the cyber domain, having come from that, the name and shame approach has been relied on again and again to some effect, and in other ways, it's had, I would call it trivial effect. There are certainly some cases where it's had what the effect we've intended, but broader than that, we have got to incorporate more of a systemic approach to response. And it has got to incorporate a much more rapid response mechanism so that we are building trust on a day-to-day level and being more transparent about our actions and intentions so that the people can judge what we are doing on a day-to-day basis rather than once in a while after the bureaucracy has decided whether or not they are or are not going to respond to something. I think that's incredibly important, not just in a national perspective, but even down to the local level.
Thanks, Jason. Anyone else want to respond to that before we go to Q&A?
I think what we need to do is treat this like a good old-fashioned marketing campaign because that's what it is. So first of all, we need to fight the fight that the adversary is actually putting in front of us. We are asking the wrong questions. We keep asking, how are they talking about us? They're not. When we put it in and sprinkle it on top of our exercises, campaign of learning excluded because you guys are getting it, but we look at what are they saying about our exercise? They're not. They're over here influencing Filipino indigenous populations on how U.S. military bases are unsafe for their community. And we're missing that conversation because we're not looking in the right places and we're not asking the right questions. So we got to fight the fight that they're actually putting in front of us. We need to play our game, not theirs. We got to figure out the rules of their game, but we play democracy. We don't play dictatorship. And we actually have a big, great toolkit that we can use. One of the things I think is very unutilized is our PAO network and ability. If we track what they're doing, we can get ahead of the story. One of the things in the social media marketing is if you're not telling your story, someone else is. And right now we are ceding that space. We are letting them tell our story. We need to tell it first. And finally, we need to grant them no quarter, joint, right? We all work together. We have different teams. We have different skill sets. We have different permissions. We all work together. When we're doing our naming and shaming, that's a good start. And some of that does work. That is our first opportunity for low-hanging fruit to better coordinate across agencies and to better coordinate with media to get it outside of the info security community and really educate people. So talk to me after if you want to know my grand plan for really getting at it. And we do need to treat it as a long-term project. A social media campaign is 3 to 5 years. We do a few weeks and then we admire it and overanalyze it. And they are treating it as a long-term generational activity.
I agree with you, Lydia. If we delay positive propaganda campaigns about our democracy just because we don't want to be seen as propagandists we're losing. We're losing the competition. Every day that we're not out there using the tools that we have to promote our values as a country and promote what we really stand up for in the world, we're losing to China, Russia, Iran sometimes. Probably not losing to Iran's influence operations. They're not that great. But just saying we have to step forward and promote that democratic revolution. As you were saying earlier, they are scared of democracy taking hold in their countries because they know that's their number one enemy, basically, to their power and control. So we have to get out there. We have to be more proactive. And I just want to put this out there. I don't know, a couple months ago, we were in London at a Five Eyes summit that Recorded Future hosted. And I met some of the IO offensive teams from other countries, from the Five Eyes countries. And they are phenomenal. And they want to collaborate with the US. They want to learn more. And I think it would be phenomenal if the Five Eyes IO teams would come together and really do what our adversaries are doing. Trailing off of each other's narratives, sharing similar narratives, identifying what they have in common and promoting that narrative to the rest of the world. I think that's what we should do.
Let me focus down a little bit more because we have a question from a very important audience member. The Foreign Malign Influence Center stood up approximately a year ago, mostly focused on election security, obvious. What can we as an Army and warfighters take away about the application of intelligence support in countering foreign malign influence at the operational and tactical level? So this is an Army audience. Now bring it down to that level. What ideas do you have?
So I'll start, but full transparency here. I would love to have my counterparts who lead that center here as well to answer that. So I'll kick it over to Lydia in a second. I think for us at ODNI, what they would say is we are a big believer in transparency in this role, but it has got to be something that we're working hand in glove as partners on with the private sector and with and frankly with other parts of the government to make sure that we're speaking with one message and we're speaking consistently about the types of behavior that is taking place. And I think that's really the goal of the center in creating it is in instantiating it is having the ability to have one place that's synchronizing that activity across at least the IC space. And I know that they are working aggressively to position the organization to be able to do that.
Yeah, let me jump in. So I live in this tactical space every day. Of all the OSINT collectors we have throughout the entire Army, and there are a lot of them, it's at the tactical space. Here's the concern, right? Yeah, if we want to get after this, there's going to need to be policy change in the Army about the way we do some things. First off, and I talk about this at the national level consistently, and that is that the national level deals on JWICs. Got it. Tactical level, we don't deal on JWICs. And so when you're talking about open source, which is inevitably unclassified, I got it, unless you're putting a number of things to it, we operate in the unclass NIPR space for open source. And so if you take that option away because you're focused on the national level or JWICs systems, you're now taking your tactical people out of the fight that you need to fight the fight on the front lines, right? And so I'll give you a quick example. When Ukraine started, and as we were assessing the OSINT collectors across the force, what they were getting, how we were answering collection requirements and such, I made a phone call to the open source team on the border in Poland. And I said, hey, talk to me about what you're doing. Talk to me about the tools that you're using, how you're doing access and all these things. And they said, we don't do anything. I said, what do you mean you don't do anything? We wait for the email dissemination to come on the OSINT reporting. I'm like, what? That's how we're disseminating OSINT email, right? So there has got to be a push to get behind the information space and what is needed to operate in this space from a resource allocation perspective, or we will always be behind. There has to be policy change to get after aspects of, again, we think in the now and not what is the social media platform or OSINT space going to look like 50 years from now, right? Like I asked a question, Jason and them get tired of me asking the question at the national level. I say, when are you guys going to start thinking about two-factor and multi-factor authentication? If you want to get inside of the enemy's decision space, you have to go fight them where they are. And fighting them where they are means on the applications and the platforms that they use. But if you can't access those because you have too much policy standing in the way that doesn't allow you to do that, you're missing a lot of information. So there's a number of things that have to change for us to be able to get there. And I agree with the PAO space. And I've turned a lot of companies onto our PAO representatives at the Army. And I give a plug to Dr. Ed Cow. I think he was on one of the other panels, or he may be this afternoon, but from MIT. He, what they're doing in the narrative space, tracking network narratives to understand where they're started, how they're started, the impact that they're having is very, very important. Those kinds of things we need from industry and academia if we're going to get into the enemy's decision space.
One more thought to echo and repeat what the previous panel said. Listen to your young personnel. We are on our second generation of digital natives. They are now starting to enter the workforce, the military. They are also being targeted by the adversaries. Teach them what to look for, teach them what the hints are. Listen to them when they say something, they see something weird. Listen to them when they have their ideas. One of the other things that is really frustrating is the amount of key information that ends up on the cutting room floor as it's being put into a slide deck up to a commander, creating some other mechanism where the crazy weird stuff or the stuff that isn't perfect can make it further up the chain so much as I've watched whole anyway. Yeah, listen to the young. Over.
I have a question here for Lydia and Dennis, but just following the theme that you said in our discussion ahead of time, in my experience, we stumble over ourselves in today's world trying to find ways to counter this stuff and to find an information advantage. It's not like we don't know how to do this as a nation. We did it very effectively in a wartime situation in World War II. Now, we didn't have cyber. We had just about every other tool in the information kit bag and leveraged them effectively. We also did it very effectively as a nation and as an allied effort in a non-wartime situation during the Cold War. And the reason we were able to do it so effectively was because we were facing existential threats and we were willing to get our hands dirty. Until we recognize this as a significant, if not existential threat, my fear is these policy issues are going to be very difficult for us to overcome. So there's a problem there. Here's the question, though, for Lydia and Dennis and then anybody else. We struggled with social media throughout the global war on terror, and it appears we still don't have an effective approach as a department and as a nation, and I would argue as a group of partners around the world. What will it take to force changes necessary to operate effectively rather than continuing to admire the problem?
Yeah. I mean, I kind of feel like if 2016 didn't do it, what is? I think honestly, it's going to take the right person to really be targeted by it. I don't know.
Yeah, look, I think it goes back to my comment about conflict versus competition. If you don't change that mindset, then your mindset on social media is not going to change, right? I mean, the way that individuals are targeted on social media these days, I mean, again, it's the algorithm, it's the echo chamber. It takes you down what you already believe. Until you start putting a messaging campaign around and putting some effort into what this really means as an army or as a nation to us, that we're concerned about it, and you view it differently, I'll guarantee you, we're going to be sitting here 5 years from now, 10 years from now, having the same exact conversation saying, what did we do wrong? And you talk about an existential threat. Like, I don't know personally, and I guess because I sit here as like many of you, and I see this stuff every day, and we can become alarmed by it, and the average citizen does not, and probably doesn't understand, so it's reaching them. But I don't know, honestly, what else it's going to take to get people to understand how much of a threat this is to us.
Yeah, adding a little bit, one of the ways, leaders, you can create a demand signal for it. Find another way to put in there, give me the information environment, battle space awareness, some way. If you create the demand signal and really follow up on it, they will do it. Yeah, part of our challenge too is other countries have managed it. The countries that have been next to Russia, Estonia, Finland, Taiwan, dealing with China. But part of our challenge too is there's an interesting shift in expectations with the second generation of digital natives. They've never had the level of privacy and a certain expectation that some people in this room have had. Some of them were their pictures were being posted in utero. They have a different sense. So yeah, I don't know. I don't have the answer, but I will say maybe some fun education. One of my favorite accounts is the National Park Service. If you don't follow them, follow them. They're doing education. Like, there are ways to get it out there, but yeah, I don't know.
Lydia, we have a question for you, and just for context, I don't know about you all, but I can open up any social media platform, and within a couple of minutes, I am reading something that's divisive, that's trying to be us versus them, which I find very, very disturbing. And in many cases, leading right into some crazy conspiracy theory. Even on LinkedIn, I see this coming in, which is, that's supposed to be a professional platform. It's seeped into there. So Lydia, here's the question. In percentage terms, how much of the US's divisive commentary online is the product of Russian or Chinese, and I would add Iranian and North Korean troll farms?
Probably less than you think. One of my catchphrases is that I feel like by 2018, the Russians were able to roll out their mission accomplished banner on their intent to influence US in 2016. In 2016, it was pretty easy to tell a Russian troll from an American online. By 2018, it was much harder, because what they succeeded in doing is getting us to lower our bar of behavior. So if you want to talk about an effective information operation, honestly, they don't even have to do a lot of it anymore. We do it. They just amplify our accounts. They just amplify our messaging. So sadly, I think a lot of it, there may be some seeds, but Americans have really taken it over for them. And how can we find a way to remember who we are as a country and become more whole and united again? I don't know, but sadly, I think a lot of it is actually not them.
I had a chance to talk with some Russian dissident investigative reporters following the 2016 election. They were discussing, now I don't know if this was part of their information warfare campaign, or if this was, giving me the facts. But they said basically that the Russian efforts to interfere in the 2016 election, they were given carte blanche to try anything, throw spaghetti on the wall and see what sticks. It was very, very Sandlot. And then they learned, and then they refined it. And the Chinese were watching, and the Iranians were watching, and the North Koreans were watching, and they're all involved in, improving these capabilities. So I would say, I would disagree with you a little bit and just say, I think there's a lot of that out there that maybe our adversaries are not starting it, but they're certainly throwing gasoline on the fire in every way possible to create an advantage over Western nations. Here's a question for everyone. And this is, I think, very important. Because of active information operations, there have been material strengthening of the public-private sector relationship, Microsoft, OpenAI, for example. Can the same be said of the social media platforms? So what role does government, public-private cooperation have with dealing with this problem through some type of partnership or cooperation, or whatever you want to call it, with social media companies?
So I'll start. I don't know about social media companies. Charity will say, here's what I will tell you, at least me personally. I've spent the last year on what I call my academia and industry roadshow. I have been to more colleges and universities and industry partners over the past year than I ever thought that I would, to talk about how us, as the U.S. Army in particular, can get after a lot of these problems and issues. And here's what I will tell you: that I don't think a lot of people writ large in the Army know, and that's okay. There is some incredible work going on in academia and industry to tackle these hard problems. There's a lot, more so than I thought. I've probably been to 5 universities in the past 6 months that are really doing work to try to tackle things like mis and disinformation, deep fakes, imaging, network identification, narrative identification, like a lot of folks doing a lot of great things in this space. So I think that we have to continue to rely on them and take our problems, our gaps to them, to help us solution, because they can do it.
Yeah, I want to follow up and say we have a very broken relationship right now between the US government and technology companies. There was a point in time where there was a lot more collaboration and communication, but there were some misunderstandings around how much power our government entities had in saying what was happening or what was allowed on social media platforms. Since then, there's been, let's just call it a divorce. There's not as much accountability as there used to be. And what makes it even more difficult for those of us that are at the tactical level analyzing disinformation campaigns is we have been cut off almost completely from the data, the APIs from social media feeds, which means we can't analyze large data sets anymore. The tools that were set up by academic institutions for everyone to use, open source, are now dead because those data streams from the social media companies have been cut off. So I think there's, it's a broken situation now, but it doesn't mean it can't be fixed. I think we do need more accountability from Americans and from social media users in general to say, hey, we don't like disinformation. What are tech companies going to do about it? And then we also need government accountability to hold them accountable. But it comes down to this foundational argument between security and functionality, or security and freedom of speech. So as soon as you want to put any kind of control on social media, even though it's a private company, citizens get very upset about being silenced, especially if it's a president or a politician being silenced, then it causes even more uproar. So really what we're all tackling right now academics, nonprofits, companies, and government is how can we work together to fix this problem? But I think first it starts with accountability for tech companies.
Before we go to the last question, I'll just give you from personal experience, one area I think that is ripe for cooperation, and it is the generative AI and large language model revolution that's happening. Adversaries are going to use that to make it, to combine with information warfare activities, to make it increasingly difficult to distinguish between authentic and fake. Mm-hmm. And that is, may not be great today, but it's going to get there. But on the other side, I know a lot of my companies, one example, doing a lot of research and development and bringing capabilities to develop generative AI, large language models to secure AI by design. Because if you want to fight AI with AI, you've got to rely on accurate data, a secure, accurate data, and to improve the human-machine interface so that, you know, operators, for example, of cybersecurity technology can interact with that technology using large language models much easier, faster, and much more accurately. So that's an area I think that's ripe for development. Last question before we go to your final thoughts. Do you feel U.S. Cyber Command, and I would say the service cyber commands as well, has an appropriate and important role in countering foreign malign influence? And or are they leaving too much responsibility in the hands of other agencies, command services to address these challenges? Nobody wants to take that one? I thought it was an interesting question.
All right, I think one of the challenges that we have overall in this space is that cyber and then digital media all happens on computers, so we keep putting it all together, and they are kind of distinct problem sets, and they're distinct because behind the information ultimately are people on both ends. So they're doing it on digital, but the information process is really people based. So I would like to see more things like the TIAD and other systems within to really address the information side and to really delve into that. So that's my thought.
Anybody else? Without giving away anything classified, obviously, in discussions I've had with leadership in the Cyber National Mission Force, I can guarantee you there's a lot going on that maybe we don't see. And this idea of persistent presence, defend forward, the idea of being out there and engaging and finding ways to throw sand in the gear of the information warfare apparatus of our adversaries, I guarantee it's going on. And it's not just focused on election security. So I think the key is, you know, a lot of people, a lot of decision makers will look at that as that's not a military function. That's not your job, military. That belongs to somebody else, maybe with covert action authority. I think there's been in my assessment, my own personal assessment, I think there's been, you know, who cares who gets credit for it or what authority it comes from? Work together, use the authority from whatever agency is required and get the job done. I think there's more of that going on than maybe we realize. At least I'm hopeful. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, I'm going to jump. So I think if Cyber Command were here, I think one of the things that they would describe their activities as very focused on their mission set and sustained over time. And I think that was brought up on the last panel. That's what campaigning looks like. And so are they doing enough or should others do more? I think if you're focused on CENTCOM or you're focused on the Pacific, you should start thinking about what your campaign looks like in your area with your partners. And Cyber Command is doing what they're doing within their mission set. And so I think what they're doing is great, of course. But I do think that this is why we're here. The Army's looking at how we do it for the Army COCOMs are looking at how they can do more. I think that's the answer.
Thanks, General Barrett. Sure, go ahead.
Just one last comment. As I'm listening to everybody's responses, I'm reminded that we work in intelligence and we should be thinking ahead of the enemy. We may have lost some battles in the information space recently. We can learn from those mistakes and move forward, but we need to be predicting our adversaries' next moves. What are they going to be focused on? What are our weaknesses and vulnerabilities that they're going to try to exploit in the social media environment? And I think if we're thinking ahead and we're planning ahead, we'll have a good proactive information strategy. And even furthermore, we'll be able to defend against whatever they're bringing towards us. So
Thanks,
always
Charity.
thinking ahead.
Okay, final thoughts, lightning round. Dennis, we'll start with you. What do you want everybody to walk away with?
Change the definitions of conflict and competition. I will not quit beating that drum. 2035, right? For kinetic weapon systems, ISR, hypersonics, those things, great, no problem. But I think we need to be thinking 2060 and beyond in the information space. What does that mean? I think we're taking a short view and we need to take a long view, because in my opinion, just my opinion, the two next wars we're going to fight are either in space or in this information environment before we ever fight kinetically. And I think we're there now in a lot of those spaces. So those two things. And then finally, I would say in this social media space in particular, understanding and moving into the 3 dimensions really of social media. And that's first getting on there as the US and setting your agenda, right? How do you set your agenda in that space? 2, how do you expand your presence by what is the message that a population is receiving? And then how is it generating conversation and how are you tracking it? I think we need to understand those 3 dimensions to get into this space and execute them in order to be effective.
Thanks, Dennis. Lydia?
Didn't get to this today, paying attention to the global south, get the map of the big picture of what the adversaries are up to. So I think we're going to wake up one day and find we have no access to rare earth minerals in in Africa or South America. I think we're going to wake up one day and find they have as much power in the Atlantic Ocean as they have in the Pacific Ocean as they build ports on either side. So really look at their bigger picture, and that's what they're building their narratives around, and that's the audiences that they're targeting. Pay attention to platforms, language, and their target audiences.
Thanks, Lydia. Jason?
I'm going to try and weave together a few points here. So I guess I'm not quite there on the conflict and competition space, if only because having lived in the cyber domain and knowing how hard it is to figure out from a normative behavior when certain behaviors lead to a requirement to respond in a certain kind of way, that has been really hard to figure out and grapple with in the cyber domain. And if we are now going to want to term certain behavior in the social media influence space as an act of war, it's going to then require certain responses on our part. And that is knowing how difficult that has been. I think there's a lot more thinking that needs to go on when it comes to how we approach that. Second, when we get into certain types of when adversaries or competitors take asymmetric approaches to undermine U.S. capabilities, they do so because that's how obviously they can level the playing field at a low cost and get us to respond in a certain kind of way and spend a whole lot more potentially, right? And if you look at some of the responses that have been proposed, not just here but elsewhere, and you look at where that would project to over time, a relatively low investment by PRC or anybody else in the influence space could lead to a disproportionate amount of expenditure on our side that really is not going to, essentially level the playing field in an effective way. Certainly not for us. So I think that's where you get into what can we do about it? From an open source perspective, and what I'm most concerned about is how do we drive the IC into a place where we are not wasting taxpayer dollars to take and partner with industry and private sector who has incredible resources and incredible capabilities and valuable data, and separate from that, publicly available data. How do we make sure that we don't get that and then bring it onto the high side, make it very hard to utilize, and then really slowly operationalize that back on the low side? It's a completely ineffective and inefficient process, right? So in order to do that and much more effectively, we need to be able to be much more transparent and much more rapid in how we are operating in the open source space in the IC. To do that, and without getting overly bureaucratized, we need to simplify the tradecraft practices, and we need to simplify the policies that enable our 18 IC elements to be able to operate, to General Barrett's point, on their own, I think that's where she was going, operate within their own domains much more effectively, coordinate with each other along certain vectors, but don't overly bureaucratize and slow down a process because you've got 18 different policies for how you're going to action. I think from an IC perspective, that's certainly what we're focused on at ODNI, is simplifying the tradecraft, developing common standards so that our 18 elements can go operationalize that how they need to without worrying about, how's that going to differ from someone else. Stop.
Charity, you have the final word.
I'll just be very quick. We need to use information operations for deterrence. Putting our narratives out there for the world to hear. People want to hear more positive messaging. So tell them, evangelize the democratic way of life, promote positive initiatives, partnerships, alliances, and projects that align with our country's priorities and that also weaken our adversaries' strategies. So they're fighting a war with diplomacy. We have to get out there and promote our message just as much, or maybe even drown them out. That's all.
Thank you. Well, I told you you were going to love this discussion, and please give a round of applause for these great professionals.